Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks what atheists should be doing next in a godless world.
Nathan, part of this podcast is to explain what. I wasn't listening to the introduction 30 seconds ago. What is the mission of Beyond Atheism?
Well, in the introduction, I say something about we're trying to figure out what atheists should be doing next in a godless world.
All right. So that's a good question, but
Yes.
what do you mean by in a godless world?
I think there are two meanings for that. The first one is that the universe is literally godless, that God doesn't exist and we're kind of on our own here. And this is what atheists think about the universe. So that's one meaning. And then the second meaning, I think, is maybe a more interesting one, perhaps for our purposes, which is that a godless world is one in which a significant percentage of the population doesn't believe in God. So it's a situation where it could be the majority or just a very large percentage of the population doesn't believe in God.
Right,
and
which is and that's something that it's a trend that we see happening, and we don't know when it's going to stop or if it's going to stop or how long it's going to go, because there are all sorts of things. Actually, the process of secularism is something we need to talk about another time, but like this point that like we're seeing it now, right? This transition from godless people without a religious belief, what we've referred to as nuns or secular people, Nones, not nuns. This move from a very tiny minority to moving now to something that could be a plurality. Soon it'll be the largest minority. It might become a majority at some point. But this is like, what do you see in that change? What is the difference between being a secular person in a, I don't know, I want to take Sagan's term, a demon haunted world, but how about like a theist haunted world to an atheist world, to a godless world? What happens in between?
I think in a situation where atheists are kind of a persecuted minority, when it's not quite a theocratic regime, but it's one in which atheists don't have rights and so on, and religious people are dominant. I think that the goal is for atheists to win rights and to win sort of toleration and acceptance. So obviously there are definitely places in the world that are like that. In other parts of the world, mostly in Europe and the US and Canada, where I'm from, and elsewhere, I think we're moving along more to atheists and other non-religious people being a significant percentage of the population. And in some places, like you say, like a plurality or even a majority. So then I think basically the podcast is kind of talking about what, in a situation like that, what should atheists be doing? Because atheists have already won rights and toleration and so on for in many places. In we'll say in like European countries and so on, and like in many or some states in the U.S. So the question is, when atheists gain more and more power, like what then? Like what do they do next?
So the thing I want the audience to know, and exactly as you laid it out, like everything you just said there, it's about us. It's about us as non-believers. What do we think? What do we feel? What do we need? What do we want? None of this, or as little as possible in the podcast, is a reaction to what religious people do. We're just not interested in that. We're thinking about how do we as people shape the world in a way that we want it. And I think this leaves us with the next interesting thing is, of course, like who we are. What do we mean by who we are? And what what do we want in the world? I think there are some things that we know we want, right? We want to be tolerated and accepted socially, not always being the Bond villain.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And I mean, I think there were, I'm not sure if there had been property restrictions, but in the US, there were times when atheists couldn't be witnesses in trials because they wouldn't swear in a Bible or something like that. They're just not trustworthy. Moving past that, from a tiny minority to a plurality majority, how is it that we're going to shape the world? And we're starting to see some of this, aren't we? Is there anything that we definitively know?
Yes, I think there. I think. Well, sort of to transition into our interview today.
An interview? Oh, this is great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think one thing that scholars can do is to try and help us understand what the current state of the religious divisions in society are, and what we know about atheists and other non-religious people and their own political views and the demographics and so on. So in today's interview, we're going to be talking with Juhem Navarro-Rivera, who is a scholar of non-religion and who's studied these topics.
Yeah,
so
excellent. And it's going to be great. I get the sense that he's made some of the same observations we have. I bet he's going to. What I really look forward to this is that he's going to agree with us. That's what I hope.
Well, that's the sign of a good guest.
That's what I'm most excited about.
Yes. All right. Well, let's bring on Juhem.
All right.
We're excited to be joined today by our very first guest ever, Dr. Juhem Navarro-Rivera. He is the political director and managing partner at Socioanalitica Research. He is a leading scholar in the study of secularism, race, and politics in the United States and Latin America, and the author or co-author of countless articles, chapters, and reports on secular demographics and politics, and on Latinx political behavior. He holds degrees in political science from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, for his BA, and the University of Connecticut, where he did his MA and PhD. Juhem, welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast.
Thank you for having me, and I feel honored to be the first guest.
Well, if it's a little choppy, you'll understand why. Be gentle with us.
I ran a podcast for over a year, and it was about Latinx humanism and atheism and whatnot. And it started awful, and when we were getting good, like life got too hard for all of us.
Oh God, I can imagine. Of course. Oh, so wait, you've run a podcast on Latinx humanism?
Yeah, it was the Benito Juarez experience. I did it it started in 2017, I believe, and ran it, I think, almost a year, every week, with Luciano Gonzalez, who is also like a minor Latinx humanist celebrity in Twitter.
Oh yeah, I know him. Yeah.
So Luciano and I did for a while, but then like Luciano was finishing school. I was like kind of like trying to run Socioanalitica from the beginning, and just like life happened.
So like that, the secular and the humanism, has that always been a big part of your life?
I mean, if we count my life starting in my 20s, yes.
So how did you get to studying secular communities? Is this part of a ongoing your PhD research, or is this more of the passion project?
A little bit of both. I didn't use it for my PhD dissertation per se. Eventually, my dissertation was on Latinx politics, and I use religion and secularism a minor aspect on a larger measurement I was using for the whole, like, it was measuring ideology and whatnot. But I kind of started, I wouldn't say accidentally, but coincidentally. I was working on, I was the first years of my PhD, and I was at the University of Connecticut in Stores, and there was this call for a research fellow at Trinity College, the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. And I applied to it. Like, I had this interest in religion and politics going back to probably my Catholic school days,
Uh,
but definitely during my years in college, where we didn't have a religion program at the University of Puerto Rico,
mm,
but I took every religion course I could take. And I think the only ones I didn't take were the ones in like in the history department, humanities, kind of like
yeah.
New Testament and stuff like that.
Mhm,
But the ones that were like more practical, like religion in Latin America, religion and politics, was in my department.
mhm,
Another on the history of Puerto Rico and whatnot. I took all those as much as I could. So I had that interest, and I also did a lot of stuff on polarization in Congress
mhm,
for my graduate program, and a lot of that was focused on these aspects of like religion and secularism. And it's interesting because I was doing all this research on white nationalism and Christian nationalism and evangelicals before it was
yeah.
cool.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
Yes.
Before it really mattered.
Well, before people realized that it
Yeah.
Yes.
mattered.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I guess so.
Yeah.
You were the avant garde there.
Yeah.
So that it's weird because I think this is a common thing that happens where people who take religion very seriously are often atheists. So that's a big was that a big swing to go from focusing on religion and then into studying secular people?
No, mostly because I started at Trinity
Mm,
with Barry Cosmin and Ariela Kaysar doing the American Religious Identification Survey, and so one of the things that because it was the Institute for the Study of Secularism, like our
yeah.
focus was, and they having so much experience, they have ran two other versions of the survey, like
Mm,
18 years before and in 7 years before, so they were great mentors. And so like me not having an academic background per se, like my political science program was pretty standard political science.
mm,
Mhm.
Not UConn didn't have and still doesn't have any religion and politics kind of like sub program. So it was like a new school for me in that regards, and they shaped me a lot and connected me with a lot of scholars
mm.
that to this day I am well acquainted, and every once in a while connect, like Ryan Cragen, Phil Zuckerman,
Mhm.
John Shook.
Yeah. But I guess, I mean, in general, studying secularism and secular people and so on from an academic perspective is a fairly new thing in general, it seems. I don't know if
Yes,
what
I
you,
would say two things. It's
uh,
one, yes, mostly because of this boom, like it's gotten a
yeah.
lot of attention. So before
Right.
that was kind of like obscure.
Hmm.
But I think the
Yeah.
other aspect is that now you have secular people taking the lead on these.
Yes.
So
Right.
you have people like Barry and Ariel, kind of like secular
Mm,
Jews. I'm an atheist, well, I'm a humanist,
Hmm.
non-believing
mm,
theistic person, like Joe Blanco and Dusty Hosley, who are doing the secular community survey with me, are also secular people, and of course John Shook, like Phil Zuckerman, Melanie Brewster. So this is a
Hmm.
bunch of people who
Hmm.
like are also secular in their outlook, and they're
right.
I think from a
Yeah.
personal perspective are interested in these communities because they feel connected to them the same way that a lot of Christian scholars do a lot of social science on Christianity.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
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 So that really it's like you're building onto a field that kind of exists, right? There's this growth in secular studies, and now it's secular people taking the lead on it. How has the view changed between when you when you started Trinity and sort of the results you found in your survey of secular people during the 2020 election? Or is that too much? Is that too wordy, Juem?
I'm trying to break it down.
Yeah. So two parts. One is, I guess, like what when you started examining secular people, what was known about them, and then after that, I think, like what is it that you've recently found? As like an overview of what you found recently.
Okay, back in those days, like we kind of like the knowns was like an obscure-ish term. Like I think it had been used a little bit in sociology, but for example, in popular surveys, like Gallup used the term unchurched. So it wasn't,
Unchurched.
unchurched. That was the
Oh my
term
God.
that Gallup used
Mhm.
for to refer to these people. And so we kind of like like so. But once one thing that people probably don't know, it's that the Pew Religious Landscape Survey came
Mhm.
out a year before the ARIS, and we have like about the same amount of knowns in both studies. It makes sense. I mean, both huge national samples.
Right.
Instead, Pew, it is a lot of what it tells you about what is framing in research. Pew focused on like Christianity, that's still the dominant religion.
Yeah.
Also, they didn't have a trend because they technically have a previous survey to latch on
Yeah.
to talk about trends, but essentially, like they found it's actually 1% more than we did.
Wow.
And then we did the 2008 and the Institute for the Study of Secularism. So we kind of like highlighted those numbers, and that's how the knowns actually entered the consciousness. But Barry and Ariella doing a lot of interviews when the survey was released.
Yeah. And to back it up,
Yeah.
how did Pew define nuns? Because this is the NONES, nuns,
Yes.
not NUNS.
They use the term to this day. They still use the term religiously unaffiliated.
Okay.
Okay.
So it wasn't on church, so they assumed that they were going to church if it wasn't the case. But yeah, they still use the term religiously affiliated. They started use knowns as a kind of like I would say SEO label. Because people don't talk
right.
about the religiously unaffiliated about outside of these circles. Like they call them the knowns. Even I would say spiritual but non-religious. It's kind of funny because in those days I don't think it was a thing, at least in terms of how people identify themselves.
Yeah.
It became a thing as journalists started talking about this concept, and now I'm starting to see spiritual but not religious picking up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like interesting how things have changed. But in those days, we didn't saw, and the big difference between the Pew polls and the ARIS polls is that the ARIS polls were open-ended, which if you have any statistical background, takes a while to code. So it was coding that data set. And the Pew has like this long list of denominations. So we got a lot of we got these open-ended responses, and we didn't get a lot of spiritual but not religious. Those SBNRs wasn't a thing until it started catching up in the media. People trying to define it in a way, mostly because most of these people were not religious but weren't actually atheists. So the like journalists and writers started to find a name for them.
Is that what? Because we noticed this, and I kind of had a bit of a crisis the other day. I was like, what does that even mean when someone says that they're spiritual? Because I had to just run to Google and look up a definition, and the definition was very unsatisfying. It was something like religious,
or relating to religion or something.
Relating to religion.
Yeah. So,
right. Like, so what is this? Is it just a catch-all term? Is it? Do they know what it means?
I don't really know. It's quite interesting. It's a phenomenon that I've seen it evolve into the sense that now people kind of identify like that. But I think it's in the sense that that atheists in particular, like, it's interesting because the non-religious have a better people in the United States have better opinion of the non-religious than they have of atheists. And so I think it's a way of a lot of people saying like, we're not one of those. We're kind of like, I'm looking my own path. I would say maybe seekers, although like, I haven't seen many people use the word seeker. And usually when I see someone using the word seeker, I have a few friends like that. And it's people who jump into different religions. They never said
it's a type.
Yes. But essentially it's like kind of like acknowledging some kind of supernatural without having this personal Yahweh kind of relationship,
Mm.
because it's not even kind of like the more Jesus-y type of like people who are not, they don't have their personal relationship with Jesus, but they're not religious,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is it's
And
a weird blend between like maybe an unaffiliated Christian, which is
right.
religiously
Yeah.
unaffiliated. Those are more rare.
Yeah, but they're not necessarily. They don't seem to be drawing things from the Bible. They're not attending religious, um, or, religious mass or temple every week. They're just kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And so that's been a change. How is the overall population of secular people, the unaffiliateds, the nuns, changed since you started this research to your recent study?
One of the most interesting things, I'm trying to find my old blog posting here now on the background, because I did the Secular Voices survey, one in 2019, and then the 2021, actually the one in 2020.
Right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
this year's confusing. So the one in 2020 was interesting because it was a national sample. So I basically pulled out some questions for a non-religious subsample, but I did a national sample, did like the whole electoral thing. But the 2019 was just a secular sample.
Okay.
And that was interesting because I did recreate it or re-ask some questions from the IRS. And my favorite part was that in the growth of the kind of like the atheists, like the non-believers, because I think more people are more likely to be non-believers now than they were in 2008. I repeated
Yeah.
that question
Mm.
of belief in God, which was kind of like, there's no such thing, and then like there was the hard atheist, then two versions of agnostic, no way to know, or I don't
Yeah.
know. Then like there's a higher power, and then there's like God, dude. There's a personal God. And since the two surveys, like it's like 11-year difference, the percentage of agnostic atheists and well, hard soft agnostics, and as Barry used to call them, and the atheists actually grew. And I think it's mostly driven a lot by, I think younger people have stronger opinions about that
Yeah.
now. I think partially maybe that people are more secure in these positions. Like, it's been a decade now. It's a lot is driven by younger people.
Mm.
And I think in that regard, it has become more accepted to be an atheist, even if it's still a lot of discrimination, and a lot of cultural pressures.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then
Definitely.
it's certainly more accepted,
Yeah.
especially among younger people.
Yeah. And I mean, to be able to note that even across 10 years, that seems like a really short time for something as big as this.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember at one point we were having the discussions about releasing one of the reports, American Knowns, which we released, I think, was in later 2009.
Mm.
And because people kept asking us about about these knowns, and so we released a report only on the knowns.
Yeah.
And so we did, it was Barry Ariella, with me and Ryan Cragen, who is at the University of Tampa. And I remember at some point, I think it was Ryan who predicted that, in a few years, a quarter of the population was going to be non-religious. And I was like, really? uh, and well, time proved him right.
Yeah.
One of the things Todd and I have been sort of discussing is the value of talking about nuns, like sort of lumping in atheists and agnostics with these non-religious or like the religiously unaffiliated, who might include this like spiritual but not religious. I'm just wondering if you, what do you think about including these groups all together as nuns?
I think they're useful. I think it's a useful category, mostly because I think there's the non-religious, from my analysis and from what I've seen and knowing a lot of people who are non-religious, and so I have like this large data perspective, and also the personal experience with a lot of nuns, although now much less. I've become so involved in the secular movement in the last few years that like most of my networks are now like people in secular groups or who have belonged secular groups or who have been active in some way and are openly non-theistic, and so it's it's a little different now. But one of the but I think it's a good analysis. I mean, a good way of analyzing, lumping them together, because the differences are, I think, often more. They're not a difference of kind. They're more a difference of emphasis. Like in many ways, the knowns, like the religiously unaffiliated, are still people who don't go to church. They don't really think that much about religion. It's very different. Like the atheist and the agnostic are special categories, especially when you ask them, like Pew, as an option in the survey, because that's more of an activist label. It's the people who say that they're atheist or agnostic are more likely to belong to groups, and so it's more of an identity. But then you have like a lot of these nothing in particulars, which is the option that it's lumped to make it to create the religiously unaffiliated. It's people who say nothing in particular. They a bunch of them are atheists. I mean, when you get to that question on belief, they're atheists and agnostics. And so you have these dynamic in which, like, they will report, especially if you don't have the belief question, you will have this reporting of like only like maybe 8% of Americans are atheists or agnostic, when in reality it's like closer to double that. Because then you have all that people, which include people like me, which is like I don't think atheist or agnostic is a religion, so I would say I'm nothing in particular. And then like if you ask me, you believe in God? Hell no.
Right.
Right. So I think that's so there's a lot of those type of atheists in there, which is like people who don't believe in God but also don't identify as atheists. And then there's a lot of what John Shook calls apatheists, which is people don't really, and I think it's really interesting because for us in this space, like we think a lot about this, but there's a lot of people who don't think about it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's fine. Like I remember he telling me once that like our job is to make this the world safe for the apatheists, in the sense that there's people who live their lives and they may think of it, but usually when it comes to like, oh, I have to baptize the kid because I have to throw a party, or like, and I know that because coming from Puerto Rican community and also having Mexican family, a lot of these things are done because of tradition. Like all these christening ceremonies and even church weddings. It's just a matter of like doing it because somebody did it before you, and that's the way it's done. But it's not. Nobody really cares about that.
Right. Totally, they're cultural signifierifiers that are kind of, they're almost empty gestures. But the things that sort of what's weird about that, Juhem, I'm going to editorialize a little bit, is that that's how they keep the power. Right. That when you see other people doing it, you believe that they believe. So everybody is sort of all in the room saying, well, I guess this is important. I guess everybody else believes this. So I see why it would be much more difficult to break away and declare that you're against that. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And your answer really cleared up a couple of the sort of critiques that Nathan and I have run into when we try to talk to people about nuns. One of them that we've heard is that people who report no religion are actually quite religious. They either actually do believe in a God, or they believe in a higher power, or that maybe they even go to church. They're just saying that they're not affiliated with any church. Is this something that like the Secular Voices survey has been able to like what you're saying now is that they're actually nuns are nuns. They don't think about it. They don't go to church. They don't worry about it. It's not really a force in their life.
Yes. I think I'm trying to find the numbers in here, but essentially, like going to church, it's very rare among the nuns. Like I would say, I'm off the top of my head right now, but it's closer to 80% of people who say they never or seldom, and then like people who go weekly, it's less than 10%.
Yeah.
So it's and obviously people who identify as atheist and as agnostic is closer to 100%. I don't.
Yes.
But then there's also this other aspect, which is something we are trying to do in the secular community survey that is now being fielded,
Yeah.
which is we have a lot of religious people who are non-theistic. So we have the ethical culture congregations. We have Unitarian Universalist churches, and a lot of particularly Buddhist and Jewish humanists who
Yeah.
actually do go to religious services, and they're not that rare. I mean, they're rare in the larger scheme of the population because these are small numbers. But within the non-theistic community, they're not small numbers. In fact, it's kind of funny because before I logged in here, I'm revising the proof of a chapter I wrote on humanism, because that's another thing. Like humanism as a political category is not really studied. So I did a chapter on the politics of humanists, and I defined humanists with people who are non-theistic, and like their morality doesn't come from God or a religion. And I did the political chapter. My wife did the demographic chapter, and so I was just seeing that in one cross reference I cite her, and 17% of humanists of this subset of then of many of them are not knowns, but 17% of humanists are religious. Like they either go to synagogue, or they belong to an ethical culture group, or they belong to a Unitarian, or they are Buddhist. So it's it's a very complicated dynamic in there. But even if you look at the non-religious, like they're truly non-religious. Like most of them won't go to church or any other temple or anything like this. So not just church. I mean, this is a Christian, Christian supremacy working there. But also, even if they believe in God, like they believe in the same God as Christians do. Like it's certainly a very different kind of God. Even if it's Yahweh, it's a Yahweh with a very different personality than like a white evangelical would have.
It might even be their own. So this, by the way, you get a lot of points for citing your wife's work in your chapter. That's brilliant. Oh, but that brought up a point that it's kind of shocking how solidly democratic, how solidly of the left your work finds the secular people to be. I think it's something like 65% vote Democratic, which is about as strong, I think, as Christian evangelicals, which is it's a powerhouse block for the Republicans, powerhouse block for the right. And if you could talk a little bit about that, what you find the political views of secular people to be, which is, I mean, just hit after hit in the Secular Voices survey. But you just touched on something, and maybe you can say a little bit more about it, where these views come from. Because I don't know if your work has been able to sort of disaggregate cause from effect. Is it this irreligion, this being a nun, being separated, not attending a church, being separate from an institution, rejecting the worldview of religion? Does that make people left, or is it people who have an ideological predisposition for leftism that become atheists, become nuns?
I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think there is an element, and I have these discussions over the years with, for example, I was at PRI for a few years, and I used to have all these discussions all the time with Robbie Jones and Dan Katz. And one of our big findings back in, I think it was 2013 or so, was that a lot of nuns, especially younger people, would say that their church's treatment of LGBTQ people affected their way of, their views on religion.
Wow.
Now, what does that mean? I mean, my interpretation of it as a rank and file known was that I think, given how society it was moving, and we're talking about younger people, we're talking 2013. This is almost 10 years ago. My God, if I'm allowed to use that term, uh, it's that I think people were having doubts, and just these things, seeing, with higher visibility, better representation of LGBTQ people, which is not great, but it was better than in the 80s.
Yeah.
Let's say, I would say people who grew up more comfortable with LGBTQ identification and people who identified as that would think it's, and knowing that, these are not hellish people, like they're not bad people, I think would find it odd why my church has these issues with them. But at the same time, I think people who are thinking that already were having other issues with their religion.
Yeah.
That's one aspect. And then you have the other problem, that particularly this big wave of knowns, the one we found in 2008. These were people who grew, who were mostly coming from two places: from mainline liberal churches, so mainline Protestant, from the more liberal side of churches, and so you weren't seeing many white evangelicals in there, and Catholics. And it tells you a couple of things, like, I can talk from the Catholic experience, which is like, you grow up with these things, and I mean, do you really believe them? I mean, I had problems. I went to Catholic high school. I had problems with transubstantiation. I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of people who were in that regard, coming from very weak traditions. You kind of growing them, but you don't really practice them. Like, I didn't grow up going to church. Like, I went to Catholic high school, but I didn't go to church. And so I think there was people already with weak attachments who essentially became honest about their views. And I think now there is a wave of people who grew up with those weak attachments, now realizing that they didn't really grow up religion. So we have also like these big, this kind of like increase in people who report growing up non-religious. And I think it's just a lot of people realizing, you know what? I wasn't. And I struggle with this question all the time. It's like, what was I raised as a Catholic? Maybe. I mean, I was put in a Catholic school. Yes. Was a, did I go to church every Sunday? No. Did I did my sacraments? Well, I was in a school. So I did them because of that. But if I hadn't gone to that school, I probably would have done it. So was I really a Catholic? I don't know.
Yeah, right, I know, and that's the habit in my family is, or was, like going to mass every week, taking communion every week, going to confession whenever you were forced to, and then as soon as you get confirmed, you never go again, right? Which is like, confirmation is supposed to be like when you come out as a Catholic and you're part of the religion now, and for at least members of my family, that was when we were finally able to stop pretending.
Yeah. Oh my God! Don't talk me about my. So the funny story about my confirmation was that I got confirmed at 16. Because my grandma, who I love dearly, like kept pestering me. Like there's they're starting confirmation classes in the parish, and I was like, okay, like she kept pestering me. By the way, I truly believe that the priest who was running that parish in those days, it was from Spain. I'm pretty sure he was part of Franco's like hitman or something. Back in the day, like he acted like a spy.
Wow.
But anyway, so here's what my grandma tells me this. The year after that, like, she becomes a born again Christian. I was like, couldn't you have done that the year before? And I'm like, come on. And that's why my brother didn't get confirmed.
Yeah, right. Juhem, my brain just went into 15 different directions about all of these background effects, right? Like the role of family in shaping your religion. Because one of the things that we know is, like, there has to be this snowball effect, where once someone raised without a religion, we know that they generally do not join a religion. But right now, people who are born into a religion are generally, or have a higher tendency to leave religions. So it seems that as secularization, for whatever reason, proceeds, we end up with this snowball effect where we get more and more of these secular people coming out of it. I'm going to take a second here to transition to your next study, the one
Sure.
that's ongoing now, the Secular Community Survey. This is one that you're looking for information about the religion that people have come out of, right? Correct?
Partially. So this is a like long time coming. So in 2018, I met Joe Blanco in a conference. It was actually a secular social justice conference in DC, and Joe came all the way from California, and I only know Joe by name. Like he had this paper on secular organizations that I really liked, because it was something I wanted to get more. Like research on the nodes is interesting, like these public opinion trends, but research on secular or organized secularism is rare. And so I really liked his paper, and then a common friend introduced us. I actually went to greet her, Dr. Zikibu Hutchinson, and so Zikibu introduces us, and she's like, "Oh, this is Joe Blanco," and she's like, and then she's like, "This is Juhem Navarro," and I'm like, "Oh." And then like, "Oh, I've been meaning to talk to you, to email you." And he's like, "Oh, the same." So we started talking. And so, he's not a quant like researcher, and I'm a poster. And so, we started thinking of ways of collaborating, and one things get to the other. I'm starting my job as in Socioanalitica, like it's in diapers in those days. And like time passes, and then last year we reconnected. The last time I traveled actually was to give a talk. We were together having a conversation at UCSB, the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I was his guest. And so we retook the project in there. And then luckily, he had this project that he's working, the Meaning of Religion project, hired Dusty Hosley as a postdoc. And so with the three of us like putting work here and there, we were finally able to launch it. So we're looking at very different things of particular people who have joined secular organizations, which is a subset that I've tried to do some with the Secular Voices Survey, like asking this battery of questions of have you joined these organizations and whatnot, where I find, but as a political scientist, like I'm interested, these people who join secular organizations are much more likely than nuns who are not joiners to be active in politics. And it makes sense. And now that I'm in the board of the American Humanist Association and a few other organizations, I find this particularly interested because it's people who are very active, but they don't seem to do their activism in the secular movement. So they're very active in politics, but doesn't seem to go that way, which if we have time, I'll have more on that. But so it's a mesh of looking, and Joe also wants to know about these different these joiners and their upbringing, like like their religious beliefs, especially because we have these and we open it for like the screener. Essentially, if you are a secular joiner, if you have ever been part of a member of these groups, but that means that we open these to a particularly subset of knowns that are not knowns, which is people who are in these Jewish, secular, humanist Jewish congregations, people in ethical culture congregations, people in Unitarian Universalist churches, Buddhists. It's kind of like the four bigger chunks of religious kind of secular people who are big part of the membership of various groups. Particularly AHA has a big contingent of UU people and ethical culture and humanist Jews. So we're looking at that, like, what's your background in your religious background? What are your beliefs? Because the other aspect that, we're kind of thinking is like, what do secular joiners believe in? Like, it's all atheists, or do they have like these, kind of like supernatural beliefs of some sort, or like, into a spiritual realm or whatever you want to call it. Because, for example, in my surveys, I also do the labels, like, kind of like it, which is kind of always, I find it funny because I call it the Secular Voices Survey, and it's a secular community survey, but the least common label is secular. Right. The irony is not lost on me. But the spiritual but not religious is now the most common one, which I would say that 10 years ago it wasn't going to be.
Mm.
But what is interesting is that the SBNRs are usually never secular joiners. So that is the people who answer the battery that at least have been a member of one kind of group ever in their lives. They're the least likely to identify as spiritual but not religious. So,
Oh,
so I'm
wow.
not sure we're gonna find any of those or many of those, but belief in other things. It may be we're also interested in like upbringing, like in terms of like religious ceremonies.
Mm.
Do you practice any ceremony, or do you have created any secular rituals, or you practice any secular rituals?
Mm.
Then some political questions, because why not? That's partially why I joined.
Right.
So policy questions, kind of like to confirm or like test some of these findings that I have in elsewhere. And then also like future rituals, like thinking thoughts about death, like what do you want to do? You want a religious funeral? What are you gonna do when you die? Well, you're not gonna do much, but what would you like to
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the gist of the survey, like these
Mhm.
aspects of belief, upbringing, and what it means to be secular, and a lot about the community life, like like especially we added a battery about COVID. So how
Okay.
COVID has affected your community life, leadership in if you're being a leader in these groups, and a little bit also of community. We have that battery of political activism, but also community involvement. Particularly because we have all these assumptions that religious people are more generous and whatnot, but it may be that they have a different way of channeling that, right?
Mm.
Because you can't donate to the church and claim that you're helping, even you don't really know if the money is going to that.
Right.
Uh, but that's essentially a nutshell. It's like particularly looking at this subset of the knowns and this subset of religious people who are actually secular in outlook that we don't really know much about, and trying to learn a bit more about them.
Just going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about being raised religious or not, and the point about people who are not raised religious will most likely have non-religious kids, and that will sort of continue. I mean, I wonder if you can sort of talk about like what your thoughts about the future of secular people in the US is. Like, do you like in terms of the population continuing to grow?
I think my track record on that is not good. I thought it was gonna be slower, so I've
Okay.
been quite amazed how fast it moved. I think one of the interesting aspects that I always try to highlight in my work, it's that this is not just young people going through these. I mean, I think there's a big change driven. A lot of the change is driven by younger people, but it's not just younger people in the sense that it's young white kids with college educated. It's cutting across race. It's cutting across gender. Like when we did the ARIS, the gender split among the knowns was 60-40, so it was heavily male, and the atheists are actually still heavily male. But in the last like PRI American Values Atlas that I was able to get my hands on, it was 55-45, which is like in 10 years that has that difference has halved.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, and if and it makes sense if you look at the numbers a little bit deeper. And again, my wife, Dr. Jasmine Garcia Trejo, and I wrote a piece a few years back for a book edited by Dr. Anthony Pinn, looking at those gender aspects and those gender dynamics in which like more women and people of color were kind of like joining these. I mean, if we call it joining, but like kind of becoming part of this larger trend.
Yeah.
And it's something that it's quite unexplored. And even I remember discussing it with Joe Blanco in our UCSB conversation, and even he was surprised. Like we don't really talk about this in terms of like how people of color and women have actually become non-religious.
One part that we notice about that is like it's an increasing number across gender and across race. That's pretty wild. The one thing that the survey has in the conclusion, you seem to be pointing to this having a real political effect in the years ahead, not just the 2020 election. which I mean saw Biden's biggest supporters being the nuns. Where do you see this going politically? Do you see it having effect on the Democrats? Do you see it having a national effect, at least in electoral politics?
I think it depends. I think I mean, there's a lot of groundwork being laid in the Democratic Party. We had the Humanists for Biden kind of like affinity group, which
Yeah.
was the first time a campaign reached out to secular people, and I was part of that initial group, which had some
Cool.
amazing people in it. Greg Epstein was our chair, the humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT. We had Hemant Mehta, Debbie Allen of the Secular Coalition for America, Roy Speckhard of the AHA, Ryan Bell. So it was a distinguished group of
Yeah.
people.
But
And
the Biden campaign did this? Was it Democrats or the Biden campaign? And they were purposefully reaching out to
the
secular
religious
community?
outreach people did this. Like they asked Greg Epstein to find a ragtag group of a 30,000 humanists.
Right? Yeah.
And so there's part of that. Like in the DNC, there was even events about the non-religious cohort. The DNC meaning the Democratic National Convention, not the not the committee.
The committee.
So the DNC, the National Convention. I mean, our launch was after the convention, so there wasn't no official Humanists for Biden kind of like event. But essentially, yes. And then Sarah Levin of Secular Strategies, formerly of the Secular Coalition, is doing a lot of groundwork in the state parties, organizing secular caucuses. So there's a lot of change coming slowly. And again, like it's driven a lot by the joiners. So all of the Humanists for Biden were like people involved in some way in the movement, whether as lobbyists, political scientists, or like bloggers like Hemant, and so it's people who are part of the movement. So it's you don't have your random non-religious person who is not affiliated to any of these groups being in there, although they are like fellow travelers politically. Like the Nuns still like are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans, even if they're slightly less so than your kind of like joiner secular people. And then you have like the Center for Free Thought Equality also doing a lot of work in terms of like candidates, like endorsing candidates. They're a federal PAC, so they don't have a lot of money, so they do spend some money. But their big thing has been like giving endorsements and like raising the profile of these candidates. Most of them don't win, but most candidates don't win anyway.
Right. Yes.
But I mean, but we have now in that cohort like a lot of incumbents who get re-election and who are openly secular. And now we have like the Congressional Free Thought Caucus has a lot of members. It's increasing the membership. I'm not going to say a lot. We don't have like half the leadership in there. But
proportionally, it's growing.
It's growing. It's growing, and the interesting thing is that many of I think the most important part, or one of the important parts, is that a lot of the members are not openly secular. I mean, the only one who is openly humanist is Huff. The other ones are allies, essentially. And I think that's important because, it's kind of like, these people are not afraid of using the term, like, or joining a free thought caucus. We have that kind of wording. And then at the state levels, it's growing. I think because of the dynamic of how districts work at the local level, which is actually smaller than at the national level, I think you have some people who are now safer in those districts, who are like a more open. Now we have Brian Sims of Pennsylvania running for, I think it's lieutenant governor now. So it's growing, and most of everything is happening at the Democratic Party. Like, it's very hard to break into the Republican Party.
Right. Yes.
They put up it seems like there's a wall for that there. But before we forget, the most important part, Juhem, is in speaking of participation in politics, how can they have their voice heard in the survey that you're running right now? How does that happen?
You can go to secularcommunities.com. I was gonna mess it up now. Secular Communities, Secular Voices Survey is a whole like URL.
Yes.
but secularcommunities.com. Not
Yeah.
.org, that was taken.
No.
So secularcommunities.com, and you can click the link in there. You have like kind of like a little bit explanation of what we're trying to do, and then you can, if you're comfortable with it, like then you can click the link. Or if you want to go directly to the Secular Community Survey, just go to secularcommunities.com/survey.
Hmm.
If you already want to go for it.
Mhm.
And
Fantastic.
yeah, so we were really excited. Like we have had the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the American Humanist Association has shared it into their mailing lists,
That's great.
and the CFI, Center for Inquiry, American Atheists, have shared it in their social media. We have had a lot of groups, local groups, doing it and sharing it in their Facebook pages, and so we're really happy with the reception.
Yeah.
And I think mostly because there's a lot of need to see yourself in
Mhm.
these surveys, like the American Atheist U.S. Secular Survey. It was an amazing project. It got 34,000 responses. I'm not sure if three nerds are gonna get to that number, but I mean we're happy if we get half to that.
Right.
Yeah.
And
How long are you collecting data for? Do you
we're
have a?
collecting data for 6 weeks. So we just went through the first week, and we're going all the way to April 11th. That's the day that we will be closing. And yeah, so it's really happy. We're getting some really good feedback from people, and we're really excited to, like, when this is over, like, dig in and see what we find. We already have our first set of presentations. We're gonna be at the Non-Religion and Secularity conference in, well, now it's virtual, so
Yeah, virtually.
that was good for me. Because there's no way I was gonna go to London. Like they kind of like do it every year in England. So it was so we're gonna be there doing a panel on the survey, and then the plan is also releasing a kind of like Secular Voices survey or U.S. Secular Survey, kind of like summary report to show people, what we found, and share it with the organizations. They're being so gracious with their time. The least we can do is like show them what we found, and whatever can help their communities if they find something that it's useful for
Yeah.
them to improve or grow their communities.
No, and the report, the Secular Voices survey, which is available at Socioanalitica.com, is also amazing, and I can tell that it's going to build, that the communities one is going to build on it and be even more fascinating.
Yeah, I'm
We
trying
love,
to. Sorry,
yeah,
I was gonna say I'm struggling for time to try to write more about that survey, because there's so much I
yeah.
haven't done.
I know we barely touched on it, and there was so much we wanted to get into. I mean,
Yeah.
we wanted to go through point by point, page
Yeah.
by page. It's really rich, and you can tell that it's just the tip of the iceberg, because it leads to so much more that we'd love to know. And I know that you're looking for in the survey, such as the religious background and location, where secular people are. Thank you so much for coming on, Juhem. This was
Yes.
great.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
This was really fun, because even this conversation got me, like, I have done a few of these podcasts, and you actually asked me new questions that I've never been
That's
asked.
good.
So this was really interesting. If you want to do, if you want to dig deeper into the Secular Voices, hit me up. Like whenever you want. We can do more than this.
Yeah,
Well,
that would be great.
We can as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and please, when you finish the other survey, please let us know.
Yeah.
Love to have you back.
Yes.
Okay, we'll love to be
All right.
back there. Yeah, take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Well, that was really interesting,
That
and
was
I feel
awesome.
like
That guy's amazing.
there could have been, there could have been a lot more to talk about.
Big thing. So if people haven't read it, check out the Secular Voices survey of 2020. That's on Socioanalytica. There'll be a link below. Community survey.
Yes.
There'll be a link below for
the
that.
link
You gotta
below,
take
yes.
that. And remember, all your complaints go to, is it Nathan Alexander at Twitter?
No, Nath G Alexander. That's my Twitter. And you want to plug your Medium page?
I've got a Medium page. People can go there.
Yes.
Usually about things that we didn't talk about here.
Right.
But that's yes, and the other important thing is I don't use Facebook. So that's that.
No, oh yeah, right.
It's
Yes.
there.
Well, that's
I
like
just
an
don't use it.
an anti-plug, I guess.
You can go there and observe the fact that I don't use it.
Right,
That
it's
might be
like a
interesting.
tumbleweed sort of bounces through or something like that.
If only, yeah, we gotta learn a way to set that up. The other thing is, I think this did answer some of our questions, right? This is the important thing for you and I, right? Like, I
Yeah.
learned a lot. Like, nuns are solid. We're a group. We're growing. We can come out of the shadows now. That's pretty great. I think that's the big thing. The
And
future is godless.
Yeah, I was interested too, just like near the end, he was talking about sort of the extent in which the Democrats were sort of collaborating with non-religious people. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, right. So this is the great thing about this is we started answering questions, and instead of just getting answers, we got new questions. We've got to start talking. We got to find those people, start talking to them.
Yeah.
This was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So we'll see everyone next time.